Okay, what I'm going to do to start with is talk a little bit about the Centre for Systemic Social Work. Now, we are really, really proud of the Centre for various reasons, but I think primarily because those of us who work in the Centre, those of us who work in the Tri-Borough, are so passionate about systemic ways of working into children's social care that to be able to have the opportunity to share those ideas with other authorities and to really be part of a movement that changes the way in which we work with children and families across the country is fantastic, it's amazing, and it's just what we love to do. So, the Centre for Systemic Social Work is a Tri-Borough project which was initially funded by the DfE through Partners in Practice, and its focus is squarely on supporting our own authorities and other local authorities to use systemic ideas in social work practice in order to make the lives of children and families that we're working with better. We're absolutely clear about that. We deliver social work training courses at various levels. So we deliver a systemic practice course for frontline practitioners. We deliver a systemic supervision and management course for frontline managers. We deliver a systemic leadership course for senior leaders, directors in the authorities that we're working with. And we've also been funded by the DfE to develop the Practice Leader Development Programme, which is a programme which teaches prospective ADs of the future leadership, and leadership from a systemic perspective. Now, lots of those people in the audience are doing or have been a part of those courses, and they may tell you over the breaks how the courses are going. The feedback that we have had is that the courses are going really, really well, but then people would say that to me. The reason that we deliver the courses at these levels is that we have a really clear belief that in order for authorities to make change needs to happen from the bottom up and top down. So having a shared language that goes from practitioners through managers to senior leaders is absolutely critical. What we noticed in the Tri-Borough when we did focus on practice was that if people are learning about how to work with families differently, they're learning about how to do social work differently with families by using systemic ideas. What they really need is to be able to go to their manager in supervision and their managers have an idea about what they're talking about, right? And then what they need to do is the managers need to be able to go to their heads of service and the heads of service to know what they're talking about. And then the heads of service need to go to the directors and the directors need to know what they're talking about. So that the practice system can be modelled at every level. And what that does is tells us something about the organisation and tells us something about how we want to work with families. Because the way in which we work with each other reflects how we want to work with families. Okay, if you hadn't got it by now, that last point is really important. We are passionately systemic. I have to say that the systemic ideas are completely transformative. Once you begin to think relationally, there is no going back. It affects every single part of your life and everything that you do. You're kind of unable to see things other than in terms of relationships. And it's relationships that help us make sense of our lives and all that we do. And it's relationships that are the most important thing in the families' lives with whom we're working. Okay. So why systemic? Well, systemic because we're passionate about it, but what do systemic ideas do? Systemic ideas fundamentally reposition the way in which we think about the work. So when I first became a social worker about 20 years ago, I had an idea that when I worked with a family where there were concerns around the well-being of a child or there were concerns around risk to a child, that the way in which I should interact with a family was at a level of almost telling a family what to do. We're concerned about this, you need to do this, this and this. If you make that change, everything will be fine, we won't be concerned anymore and we can leave you alone. Systemic ideas, because they privilege relationships, they require us to think about how we position ourselves in relation to families. Because we are in relationship with families. And we bring to that relationship all of our ideas, beliefs, family of origin scripts that orient us to think about how we work with families in particular ways. So when I first came into the Tri-Borough, one of the families, I don't like to call families cases, they're families, they're not cases. One of the first families that I worked with was a young couple, both care experienced, who had just had their first child. And we were worried as an authority about the neglect that this child was suffering from. The young people, the couple, when we first met them, expected us, myself and the social worker, to get into a position of telling them what to do in order for them to address the neglect of that child. Because, as care experienced young people, that is how they experienced social work intervention in the past. What we wanted to do was something very, very different. And it's something that I'm sure you're doing in your authorities, and lots of you are practicing in this way. But what we wanted to do was let them know that our position was to support them to become the best parents they could. So we fundamentally thought we need to show them the relationship that they construct with us is all important. Because if that relationship is not going to work, it doesn't matter what we do within it, it won't be effective. So we took a lot of time to construct a relationship in which this family saw us as being helpful and supportive, and challenging the ideas that they might have had in the past about social workers being intrusive, critical and punitive. And as the course of the work developed, that relationship sustained the work that we had to do. And we had some challenging moments, but we were able to support that family to keep their child at home. So this way of working then has a liberating effect for families, because families are freed from the idea that authorities need to work with them in a way where they're just telling them what to do. If we think about the relationships that families construct, those relationships contribute to the difficulties that they're facing. The way in which we need to work with those families is relational rather than just imploring people to change. And that allows families to think about the work that we're doing with them, the intervention that we're doing with them, quite differently. And it supports the idea that there are different ways of working with families to make change. So the systemic practice, systemic ideas hold to this kind of notion that there is never one way of working with a family to make change, because there is never one way of understanding a family. If we think about ourselves in relationships, we have to recognise what we bring to relationships. And what we bring to relationships invites us to see things differently. So when we're working with families, we kind of throw out this modernist notion that we have to look at what's going on with the family, diagnose the difficulty and work with them to make change. We can think about multiple ways of working with families, any of which might fit with the family's way of being and might help the family make change. Which means as a social work practitioner, you've got loads of ways of working, because there's always a different idea about a family and what's going on with them. Models of systemic therapy, have a clear theory of change. Anyone who knows me will know that one of my favourite questions to ask, and I think the credit goes to Barry here as being one of my tutors, is what's your theory of change? What is it that you're doing with a family that is going to make change? What ideas do you have about change that influence how you are working with that family? A systemic practice model gives people a clear theory of change, which means that any work with families is purposeful and intentional. The effect that has on practitioners is that it shows them that what they're doing has a clear beginning, middle and end. You can work towards change with a theory that makes sense, that you can articulate to yourself, to managers and to families. And when that happens, we think, families get a better service because we're clearly moving towards change, and we're recognising that everything that we do as practitioners in working with a family is therapeutic. We're always interested in making change. And because the practitioners, we're always interested in making change, the work becomes much more rewarding. Because if you're interested in working towards change, you have a clear theory of change, and that change is effective, the satisfaction you have of being a worker with a family, making that change with them, is immense. So people are happier in the jobs, right? Okay, I've got one more slide. What about risk? I've been teaching systemic ideas in children's social care for a long time. And one of the things that often comes up in training courses or with large groups of staff is an idea that systemic ideas are kind of nice and fluffy and therapeutic, but they don't really fit a clear social work context where we're thinking about child protection risk. Now, I don't think that's the case. I think systemic ideas fit the management of risk really, really well, because the management of risk is all about helping families to make change. The most effective way to manage risk to children is to work with a family in order for relationships to be different so that the stress in the family and the risk to the child is alleviated. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily that working with a family means you ignore immediate risk. And it doesn't mean that systemic ways of working shunt other immediate action that might need to be taken to safeguard children, either removing them from a birth family if absolutely necessary, or for an adolescent who's maybe seriously self-harming to think about placing them in a secure unit. But what it does is attunes us to thinking that that is never the long-term answer. The long-term answer is to work with families in order to make change, because the relationship between the young person and the family is lifelong and will sustain them. So any immediate action to safeguard that child has to be balanced with work with a family to sustain those relationships for when that episode is over. So working therapeutically with families can always run in parallel with acting robustly to manage risk. And when we do that as an organisation, we're saying something very clear as an organisation and to the families we work with about what we think about the work that we do. There's a systemic idea that says there are no interactions that are neutral. Every interaction that we have, every piece of communication that we engage in carries a meaning. Now, we might have an idea about what our intended meaning is when we say something to someone or we behave towards them in a particular way. We can't always guarantee that what we intend is what is received. But the ways in which we behave towards people says something about what we think about them and what we think about relationships. And the way in which we behave towards families says something very clear about us as practitioners and as organisations about what we think about families and what we think is important. And we can be respectful, appreciative, and recognise strengths and work with them to make change, or we can do things differently. But what we need to recognise is that says something to a family and to the communities we work with about the work that we do.